One of my son's favourite sci-fi authors, Terry Pratchett, is quoted as saying, "It is important that we know where we come from, because if you do not know where you come from, then you don't know where you are. And if you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going." A similar quote is also attributed to the late, great Maya Angelou, an amazing African-American poet and human rights activist. The debate around businesses' human rights responsibilities did not begin with the United Nations. It did not start in the 20th or 21st centuries, but actually goes back centuries, perhaps millennia. Before we dive into the present day concerns of business and human rights, let's spend some time going back in history to trace the sometimes fraught relationship between business and human rights over the centuries. It's a long and rich history, and a horrific one. I want to highlight three moments, if you will, within that history. From the very first multinational companies, the slave trade, and the corporate crimes of the Holocaust. All are worthwhile to study in their own right, and all three moments really help shape and inform the current debates and laws around the human rights responsibilities of businesses. First, slavery, and in particular, the Atlantic slave trade. Some refer to the slave trade as the original corporate human rights abuse, and certainly one of its gravest. Slavery is nowadays a crime in domestic Australian law and in international law. But back in the 1500s, all the way through to the 1800s, slavery was built into the DNA of many businesses. It was their business model. Slavery was not a little human rights abuse that occurred tangentially to business activities. It was the business activity. African slaves, men, women, children, were forced onto boats by Europeans and ferried across the Atlantic to the Americas and the Caribbean islands to help provide the labour needed to cultivate and exploit the New World. Once there, they were literally sold to the highest bidder, $500, $1,000. It's estimated that over 10 million Africans were shipped over the Atlantic and sold into slavery. The British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the great European powers were in on the slave trade. Laws were only passed in the 1800s to abolish it. The second moment in business and human rights history that I wanted to talk about. In the 17th and 18th centuries, in an age where European powers expanded their dominion over much of the globe, colonising it, a little understood fact is that they did so via companies and for corporate, not just political interests. Money and profit were motivating factors in the colonisation of the globe. You may have heard of the first two great multinational companies, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. Indeed, they were some of the largest companies ever to exist. And what were they about? Well, it's kind of in the name. These two great British and Dutch companies had massive sailing fleets, troops, traders, and they grew to control much of the Indian subcontinent and Asia. These days, the malign nature and abuses of European colonialism are well understood, but perhaps the link between colonialism and capitalism less so. The third key moment in the history of corporate human rights abuses and the history of efforts to hold companies accountable for such abuses is the Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry in World War II at the hands of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. 6 million Jews died, a genocide. You may have heard of Auschwitz, the Nazis' most notorious extermination camp, where over 1 million people were murdered. Yet did you know that Auschwitz was actually not one camp, but over 40 camps? The majority of which were factories, owned by major German companies. Tens of thousands of slaves, the inmates of Auschwitz, were forced to work in those factories until exhausted they fell or murdered in the gas chambers. Gas chambers that used Zyklon B as the gas, a chemical knowingly produced and supplied for that purpose by a German company. The leaders of that company were tried at an international court of law at Nuremberg after the war. found guilty of crimes, and executed. These are three somber moments in the history of businesses' engagement with human rights. Indeed, perhaps one of the take-home messages is that business and human rights movement is dominated by tragedy and abuses. That is, corporate abuses of human rights. Nevertheless, out of the darkness comes the light. Nowadays, one or a combination of these moments is also often invoked as motivation and inspiration by human rights activists for the pursuit of greater corporate respect for human rights and for the increasing call for businesses to have legally binding human rights obligations. Fast forwarding to the modern day and contemporary efforts to improve corporate respect for human rights, that primarily occurs at and around the United Nations. Itself born out of the ashes of the Holocaust and World War II. Itself born to preserve and protect and champion human rights of all. There are other important institutions that regulate and legislate businesses' human rights responsibilities. Like the UN, there are other international organisations like the International Labour Organization and individual countries and governments and groupings of countries like the European Union. They are also important institutions that impact businesses' human rights responsibilities. But the UN is undoubtedly at the epicenter of business and human rights conversations and business and human rights governance. As you know, human rights issues are a key focus of the UN's work and that organisation's core mission. So it should come as no surprise that it is at the UN where a lot of the debates, discussions and developments around businesses' human rights responsibilities have occurred over the decades and are still happening today. The UN looms large in the history and contemporary governance of business and human rights. From the 1950s on, for example, the UN led the process of decolonisation, where European powers divested themselves of political power in their former colonies across Asia and Africa. But even as the Euro political powers departed, large Western companies, the successors, if you will, of the Dutch and British East India companies, continued or moved in to these newly created countries to extract resources, exploit labour and tap foreign markets for their goods. This quasi-colonialism was a source of concern to many and prompted several attempts to write an international legal agreement around businesses' human rights responsibilities. And indeed, a UN subcommittee in the 1990s even drafted a treaty on the topic. Alas, it never made it out of that subcommittee. Fact is, there was little appetite amongst the Western countries, nor the multinational companies headquartered in them, for binding human rights obligations for businesses. Instead, the UN took a different tack and embraced this notion of corporate social responsibility, CSR, voluntary commitments made by companies to improve their relationship with society and the environment. In 2000, the United Nations Global Compact was established. 10 short statements, one-liners, which the corporate world were invited to sign up to, voluntarily and with no force of law or pressure behind it. This was not hard law. Little to no enforcement of those Global Compact commitments, even less accountability for companies that fail to live up to those promises, and very minimal oversight and monitoring. Nevertheless, despite the pitfalls, what the UN Global Compact did was create the world's largest CSR community. With over 10,000 companies now signed up, the UN Global Compact has developed guidance, hosted forums, and otherwise tried to boost compliance through encouragement, peer pressure, and education. Not the law. It's an interesting approach to improving corporate respect for human rights. The UN Global Compact was written by not a lawyer, but a political scientist from Harvard by the name of John Ruggie. There's an old saying, success breeds success. Well, Ruggie's success at drafting and establishing the UN Global Compact and getting buy-in from the business community led in part to him being tapped on the shoulder in 2006 to explore businesses' human rights responsibilities more squarely. What should they be? And how should the law, international law, best reflect those responsibilities? Building off his victories with the UN Global Compact. It was a 3-year mandate that ended with the 3-word framework, the Protect, Respect and Remedy framework. If there's one line of international law that I want you to come away from this course with, it's this: the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework of business and human rights. Countries must protect human rights. Companies should respect human rights, and all victims of human rights abuse should have access to remedy. Protect, Respect, Remedy framework. This was John Ruggie's framework. It led to widespread acclaim amongst the global corporate community and unanimously supported at the United Nations. Ruggie's mandate was renewed for a further 3 years. This time, the question that he was tasked to answer: what the hell does the Protect, Respect and Remedy framework mean in practice? How do we implement it? That led John Ruggie to author perhaps his greatest piece of global governance, of global law, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. These were unanimously endorsed at the UN in 2011, and a decade plus later, they remain the cornerstone, the linchpin of, the start and the end of any conversation, legal or otherwise, related to business and human rights.